Well, looks like, hold on, which kind of four-sided die is this? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's two kinds. I got a two.
A two. Okay. The topic we'll be discussing today, Jeremy and Chris, is how can you make food and drink an interesting part of a role playing campaign?
Hello, and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role playing games. I'm Chris Salzman,
I'm Andy Rao.
and this week we are joined by Jeremy Bai.
Hi, it's good to be here.
We're really happy to have you here. Yeah, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us. Yeah, so I mean, we have 100 questions for you lined up here, but before we get into our topic and all that, I guess why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, what do you work on, those sorts of things.
Well, my main day job is as a writer and a translator. It is kind of a long story, but the short version is basically I got interested in China and Chinese culture.
Mhm.
I'm American, just straight as American as you could get.
Yeah.
And I ended up starting to learn Chinese. I moved there and stumbled into working as a translator,
Mhm.
essentially. And I've translated a lot of Chinese fantasy fiction. It's
Mhm.
primarily serialized web fiction. I have
Mhm.
translated a few traditional novels, although none of the novels I've translated are officially licensed. But
Oh,
the
interesting. Okay.
serialized web fiction is licensed, and I've done that as my career for quite a number of years now.
Mhm.
And I've also done some original writing projects as well.
Mhm.
Some novels that I have put out through Wraithmarked, which is a indie publisher. I've self-published some, and then I also signed up with Osprey to do a role-playing game centered around wuxia, which is a genre of Chinese martial arts fiction.
Yeah.
And right now I'm working on a secret project that I can't talk about.
Okay.
I'm waiting on a contract to be signed.
Okay.
Once the contract is signed, everything will be official and I can talk about it. But until then, I can't. And I think that contract signing might happen as of this recording in a couple days. So
Okay,
a
that's
little
Okay.
bit
exciting.
too
Yeah.
early for me to talk about that.
So
But if
you can't
anybody
use
out
like
there is,
pig Latin to talk about it or anything?
Yeah.
it's a new translation project
Okay.
and probably a big one, but I can't really say
Yeah.
the
For sure.
details.
Yeah. Well, so we're gonna have some links, I think, in the show notes here. So you were also a YouTuber, I guess, right? So when I was looking up how to pronounce Usha, and I ran across your video was the first one that popped up. So it was like,
Oh, cool.
good work on your SEO there and all that. But yeah, so we'll drop some links into there. So if anyone's interested in like, yeah, how did you get your pen name? Can you speak Chinese? Like your life in China and stuff like that. It's all really fascinating stuff, but we won't make you belabor that when there's ready material on the internet for that. And then too, if you sign that contract, we'll drop the link in.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, Jeremy, I came across your work in like there was this weird sort of coincidence. Last year, my teenager started studying Chinese language in high school. So, kind of as a joint project with them, I've been trying to read through the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but was
Mm.
finding it really challenging. So, I was looking around online, like, are there books with annotations or notes or something like that. And a book I picked up that turned out to be authored by you is Understanding Chinese Fantasy Genres.
Oh,
And I
cool.
realized that the Three Kingdoms isn't exactly like you're the expert on genres. Three Kingdoms doesn't seem exactly martial arts fantasy, but it seems to have at least a toe in that world. So this is a really neat book. And then right around the same time at my friendly looking local gaming store that really only carries D&D and Pathfinder, like randomly I stopped in and there's this Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, Wuxia Roleplaying book from Osprey, a company I totally associate with war game and military history stuff. So I was like, it's not possible to leave the store without purchasing this. So can you tell us a little bit about Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades is your role playing game co-authored with Brendan Davis, I think, who has also done some gaming publications in this general genre, right?
Yeah.
How did this come about? Did you guys approach Osprey? Did they reach out to you? How did you wind up with this book?
Well, Brendan, like you said, has done, I would say, a significant amount of stuff through his publishing company. I guess you could say Bedrock Games. Wandering Heroes of Ogre Gate is what he's known for in that regard. And Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, a lot of the mechanical stuff is actually taken not directly from Wandering Heroes of Ogre Gate, but kind of it's based on the same stuff. And Osprey was fine with that. That's kind of what they wanted from the beginning. Basically, Brendan and I met a long time ago when I was first involved with the rising popularity of the translation scene. He was actually had not yet published Wandering Heroes of Ogregate at that point, and he reached out to me to do an interview of me on his blog. That's how we connected. And then I was super interested in Wandering Heroes of Ogregate because wuxia is kind of what got me, one of the big factors that got me down this path of Chinese stuff. And so I was asking him about it and ended up getting involved with one of his playtest groups for Wandering Heroes of Ogregate before it was launched. It was kind of like toward the very end though, so I didn't really have that much input. By that point, I think it was almost in layout phase. So I didn't have too much input, but I did have a little bit. And then we kind of just remained friends through the years. I stayed with his play group for a while doing Wandering Heroes of Ogregate. Later, one of the novels that you can find on my website or on Amazon is called Legends of Ogregate. And basically, I did a novelized version of some of the ancient mythology of his Wandering Heroes of Ogregate world.
Oh,
Oh,
fun.
cool.
So it's you could consider it, I guess, an official fictional version. Basically, in the Wandering Heroes of Ogregate world, there is a 1,000-year-old history of how martial arts started, and so I went back and wrote that. And then in concert with that, me and him ended up doing a module for Ogregate based on some of the content of the novel. So it was like I
Okay.
wrote the novel, then we wrote a module. Eventually, I'm pretty sure Austria actually reached out to him because they were wanting to, have a lot of different genre titles in their role playing series. And after they reached out to him, he reached out to me because he was concerned about being able to do it all by himself. He wanted to have somebody to kind of bounce ideas off of and whatnot. And so I thought it would be great. I got involved with it because it was a passion project kind of thing. And so we spent roughly about 2 years or so from the beginning to the end. When we started the very early design phase, I was in China, and then I moved back to the United States about halfway through. We did probably about a year of game testing, I want to say, between his group. He has multiple groups. I formed a group specifically for it, and yeah, that's kind of like the process from the beginning to the end. And we published, by the time it reached the publication date, it was right in the middle of the pandemic, and the publication date got pushed back numerous times, I think because of there were so many issues during that time.
Yeah.
But it did eventually come out. I believe it came out in the UK at the end of 2020, and in US at the beginning of 2021, but I might have those dates
Yeah.
wrong. But yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I noticed that Paizo has an upcoming big product release that looks like it's set in the Chinese martial arts genre. Is there something in the water right now that is fueling like an interest in this genre? Do you see an uptick in interest in this genre as you interact with people, gamers or otherwise?
I'm not totally sure because I feel like there have been a few major spikes in interest over the past decade or so. I would say the first one was what got me sucked into this whole thing, and that was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which was in 2000.
Yeah.
That caused this really big explosion of interest in wuxia. There was a bunch of movies, or a handful of movies, like House of Flying Daggers, one Hero as well, and there were others. There was what was there was an Xbox and PlayStation game.
Oh
I
yeah. I
forget
played
what
some
it's
of that.
called.
Jade
But
Empire?
yeah, Jade Empire, yeah,
Yep.
and whatnot. But then that sort of died down by the time I started getting into translating. That was kind of dying down. And then when I got into translating, I started out doing wuxia. I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but basically there's
Yeah.
different subgenres. Wuxia is like the sort of grounded martial arts. And then there's other genres like Xuan Huan and Xianxia, which are more fantasy, magic and stuff like that. Around the time I got into translating, I was doing wuxia translating as a hobby just to improve my language skills. And then I stumbled into the serialized web fiction of this like high fantasy kind of stuff that got really popular, like really, really crazy popular. But I feel like the wave has crested sort of. It's the initial, it's so new and different to so many people. I feel like that phase has gone over. So as for where we are now, I'm not totally sure. I'm not sure if Paizo is kind of like saw that spike in interest and then got the ball rolling and it's only now coming to fruition, or if where along the line they got this idea. It's really hard to say.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't have my finger on the pulse of what's going on behind the scenes enough to know.
For
Yeah.
sure.
So I mean, so you've obviously read a ton of Chinese fantasy. Is there anything like so like right? We talk about tabletop role playing games and stuff on this podcast quite a bit. Is there anything in Chinese fantasy that's like this is a trope or something that happens in those stories that would be really great to bring to like a Western audience? Is there anything that's like your go to for like like this is a cool thing that you're just not experiencing?
Well, I would suggest going to my YouTube channel. I have 2 videos.
Oh, you
I
do?
did
Okay, great.
a survey of a couple thousand readers asking them what tropes they disliked the most and which tropes
Mm,
they liked the most, and I got 10 each. So, I won't be able to touch on all of them,
yeah, yeah.
and it really depends, like, there are some tropes in these novels which I think could work well in games, especially for people who are not familiar with them. For example, there's the young master trope. So anybody who's read a lot of these novels will know this trope. It's so common to where the main character will run into what the character trope known as the young master, who is a young, usually rich, usually important, connected person in some kind of big family or big organization, and they're like the teenage kid who is backed by this super powerful organization, usually very arrogant and,
Hmm.
trying to throw their weight and power around. And the main character always clashes with this young master character. And then a lot of times will defeat them in combat, but then that arouses the wrath of whoever is backing them. And so
Okay.
this young master trope is just so common that it's become to many people like something they hate because it
Yeah, right.
always happens
Yeah.
all the time. But
Yeah.
I think it's a great easy way for that you could throw into a game where the party encounters some person who is actually not really that necessarily that strong. They
Mhm.
get into a conflict with this person and they defeat that person only to come to realize that they've actually provoked this much larger, much more powerful organization, whether it's a criminal organization or a kingdom or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Interesting. In these, and I don't want to relentlessly quiz you about genre elements that I could probably look up online, but does the kind of the standard D&D setup of your party of adventurers, each of you has kind of a thing that you do that roughly balanced with each other, and you're roving around, getting into trouble and solving problems and gathering treasure. Is that something that translates pretty well back and forth with the Wuxia games you run?
I think it does. Yeah, it can totally work well. That said, for Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, we kind of veered a little bit away from that. Much of the inspiration for this game came from an author named Gulong, and he's one of the typical, or I should say, one of the most famous of the wuxia novelists. He was active, decades ago. He died, I think, in the 80s. And his books are a little bit unique and different. They're easy to translate, which is, I think, why so many of them are available. I've in total translated, I think, 3 of his novels.
Hmm.
And so we intentionally were taking a lot of inspiration from him, and his fight scenes are kind of unique in a special way. A lot of times in wuxia novels, and especially in books, I'm sure many of you in your audience have seen wuxia movies. Maybe they're not experts, but surely have
Mhm.
seen like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or one of the famous ones, whether the Shaw Brothers movies from decades ago or more recent ones. Especially in the movies, the fight scenes tend to be really long and drawn out. That's why they're cool. All this back
Yeah.
and forth, these special moves, and the novels are like that as well a lot. But Gulong fight scenes are a little bit different. A lot of the times, they're more a like a samurai Shambara fight scene where you have
Mhm.
two enemies facing off and like the wind's blowing and like it's showing their eyes and their hand goes down to the
Mhm.
sword and then they take the sword out of the sheath a little bit and then they run toward each other and there's like this clash and then one of them drops, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wulong's wuxia fight scenes a lot of the times are like that, and you have these really powerful, strong martial artists who they can possibly kill their opponent with just one hit, even a very strong opponent. I'm not saying this happens with every single fight
Yeah.
scene in his novels, but it happens a lot. And so we kind of took inspiration from that. And so in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, the combat is definitely more suited toward dueling or maybe small party combat as opposed to these giant melees. Now there are signature abilities for the martial artists in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, which are like for being able to attack multiple opponents, because you also have those typical fight scenes in the tavern where there's like a whole bunch of
Mhm.
goons attacking you. So it's
Yeah.
not like they're only designed to be run as duels. But that said, we do encourage that, and the way the combat phases are built is intended to like hype up that drama and tension, especially between two different characters or maybe a couple characters and one bad guy or something like that. So there is a little bit more of that flavor in the game, in this specific game. But if you're talking about a genre as a whole, the wandering heroes going through the countryside, fighting the villains, looking for treasure is definitely something that's super portable into the Chinese fantasy stuff.
We like a handful of months ago, maybe it was a year ago at this point, a number a number of sort of our group of friends were reading Gideon the Ninth. I don't know if you've heard of that novel at all, but it's pretty good. But towards the end of it, there's these like really long fight scenes that happen that are sort of hard to follow. And ever since then, like I've really been thinking about that. Like, how do you effectively describe something that you can't visually show? And it sounds like that's something that you've thought about a lot. Like, right, like how do you translate it, make sure that you're not sort of like losing the audience? Yeah, I guess, is there anything like in your gaming or like even in your translation work that you found that's like, yeah, helpful? I mean, do you sit there, do you actually have miniatures that you kind of you like move around and be like, this is where this person is, this is where that person is?
Well, that's a good question. And for on the translating side, it's not as much of an issue because that stuff has already been thought out by the
Yeah.
author.
Yeah.
Although that said, a lot of times, so Chinese language is very different from English, and Chinese is a high context language and culture, which basically means that a lot of times you have to take into context the surrounding language and elements in order to understand it. It's not very directly, a lot of stuff is not very directly stated, and that makes it very difficult sometimes, especially for me, since I'm not a native speaker. A lot of
Mhm.
those things are very difficult for me to process mentally. Thankfully, my wife is Chinese and scored top marks in Mandarin in college in
Okay.
China, and I am constantly bugging her with questions and clarifications. Without her, I would have a very hard time doing what I do. So sometimes I do have to put thought like that into it, and then of course I've done a lot of my own original writing as well. In
Mhm.
my own stuff, I'm more inclined to do what you're just talking about, planning it out, or sometimes
Mhm.
drawing, a little a scene on a piece of paper just to make sure I can keep track of everything visually.
Mhm.
That said, I'm a pretty visual person. I have an imagination that works visually, so
Mhm.
I can a lot of times do that stuff mentally without having to write it down. When it
Mhm.
comes to gaming, I have to have a physical something physical. If we're doing theater of the mind, that's fine, which I'm comfortable with that as well. But if we're doing theater of the mind and I'm, GMing on Zoom or something like that, I will always have a piece of paper
Yes. Yeah.
written. Or if I can do miniatures as well, but I got to have something to plan it out, especially if there's more than two or three people involved, and especially with wuxia stuff, the setting is usually pretty important. You want to have a cool
Mhm.
place for the fight to happen, and so I need to know like where's the furniture, where's the terrain pieces, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because it's less like standing back and you're launching your firebolt or something every turn, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I watch, Chris and I joke a lot about when we read and watch things, 10% of our brain is always thinking, like, how could I do this in an RPG session, right?
Yeah.
So when I watch these incredible fight scenes, and so are like Jackie Chan movies, are they in this genre? Drunken Master?
Most Jackie Chan stuff is not wuxia. He does have
Okay.
some that are straight up wuxia stuff, but the majority of his work is more just kung fu action kind of stuff.
Oh,
Okay.
cool.
But there's like they overlap and they blend for
Yeah.
sure.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing I noticed, and maybe I'm speaking about a different genre, but I think Crouching Tiger has a scene or two like this. In Crouching Tiger, there's a scene where two women characters are fighting in this really elaborate duel scenario. And one of the things that makes that fight so remarkable is that the environment plays this huge role in it. And so one character will get like backed against a wall and they'll turn to their left and there's a wooden pole there, and they'll grab it and use that as their weapon for a while. And it's something that I feel like would almost never happen naturally in like a D&D game.
Mhm.
But it's such a dynamic experience to watch it as they grab whatever is at hand, use it in a creative way, and then just rinse and repeat. Is that something like when you're playing, when you want that feel? Is that something? Do you tell your characters, do you trust your characters to just be in genre and say, I'm going to grab the pot of water here and use that to fend off the axe or something? How do you get that feel?
I think this relates to something that we wrote about in the Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades book, which we have a section called genre physics. and we
Mm.
kind of go into a little bit of detail about this general thing. And I think that it depends on A, your group for one thing, and B, the concept of essentially when we talk about genre physics, the way we talked about it in the book is basically we define genre physics as basically what movie your game is taking place in,
Oh,
essentially.
okay.
And that does affect like the literal physics of how things work in the game, but more than just that, the whole feel about it and whatnot. And to illustrate it with non Chinese related movie stuff, we use the example of, is your game taking place in Die Hard or is it taking place in Silence of the Lambs? So that's going to affect just a lot of different things. You know, if it's
Yeah.
Die Hard, you know your characters might want to shoot the gas tank of a car and it's going to blow up. In Silence of the Lambs, that would be like kind of weird.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I think a lot of it depends on what kind of game are you playing, what are
Mhm.
your players expecting. What we suggest in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades is that should be like an actual conversation that happens in your session 0 or before you
Mm.
start playing, so that everybody's kind of on the same page about what kind of wuxia game are we playing here, because there's a lot of different kinds of wuxia. The kind that you're describing, that fight scene, is obviously super cool, but it's in Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, for instance, that would be really tough to pull off. You could, but
Mhm.
it would be tough, as opposed to some other wuxia systems, which there's more and more coming out, which is really cool. You know, I think it's great that players have that option to check out different wuxia game systems, take what they like from this one or that one. Anyway, the point is that would be something that I think that should happen before that fight scene even gets into it. Like, are our players going to be expecting to be in that kind of fight scene where like all this crazy stuff is happening, or is it more like one of those, you know, dramatic moment fight scenes where it's more about the tension building up between the characters and then finding out who wins in this one blow thing? Definitely two kind of different feels.
Yeah, I'm trying to imagine coming up with a setting in which like you tell them ahead of time like where everything's placed, right? Like that pot of water is over there, right? Like, so just keep that in mind. Or
Yeah.
is it just the sort of thing where like you go and reach for it and tell me what you find when you're reaching?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun. So, hey, you guys, do you want to transition into our topic here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, before we go, Jeremy, is there anything else you wanted to call out? So we'll put in our show notes. So your website, you have a ton of like GMing advice and guidance for Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades that would apply not just to that game, but to any other game like this on your website. So we'll link to some of that stuff in the show notes and stuff. Is there anything else that we didn't ask or bring up about Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades, or anything else you're working on that you want to call out?
No, I think other than my secret project, everything is pretty much on my website. So if you
Yeah.
link to that, people can go there and find all my social media and join my email list if you're interested in that secret project. That's the main way I
Mhm.
announce new stuff. And
Okay.
Cool. That's
Yeah,
great.
we'll put that stuff in the show notes. And without further ado, why don't we roll into this topic, which I am hoping has like actually a kind of a tie-in here to the wuxia genre. But just to remind us all, the topic we rolled is how do you make food and drink an interesting part of a role-playing campaign?
Mhm.
And I guess I will just start by saying that, you know, in most of the role playing games of any sort I've played, but I guess mostly D&D type games, food and drink doesn't play much of a role at all, even when scenes are taking place in a location related to food and drink. Like I've played and run a million scenes in taverns or whatever, but I can't really remember the last time that the food, the actual eating experience was anything other than like a little side note before we got
Mhm.
into the action. So can we do better than that? And I don't know, can the wuxia genre in like does it suggest any ways we can make food and drink more interesting? So that's my little introduction. I'm going to stop talking now.
I feel like I could talk about this for like a couple hours. I feel like there's
Yeah.
just so much to unpack. I'll start with Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades. We actually have food stuff in there. Not it's not very heavily mentioned, but if you go to we have a section where we talk about the regions of China, and I was the one that was kind of in charge of that because China's
Mhm.
my thing, and so we have some little bullet points about the cuisine of China.
Mm.
Now, if we're talking just general cuisine related stuff, and I gotta mention I'm a kind of a foodie, and I like food
Okay.
shows. I've watched everything. I've Master Chef, Top Chef, Iron Chef, like
Yeah.
all Gordon Ramsay shows. Like
Okay.
I really
Yeah.
love this kind of stuff, and I can envision using some very high level information about cuisine to inform what's going on in a scene, or even relating to the plot. For instance, players noticing what other people are eating or what's being served to them, how that relates to who they are in the setting. Um,
Okay.
I think the most interesting thing, though, the most obvious connection to wuxia is poison. I mean,
Yeah.
poison is such a trope in wuxia. The wine being poisoned, the tea being poisoned, the food being poisoned. In Righteous Ruthless Blades, we have a list of something like 10 different kinds of poisons. So that's the most obvious go-to one. It's a
Yeah.
big genre
Mm.
trope, and I think it could easily be ported into any, setting, whether it's D&D or whatever it is. I feel like when I'm running a wuxia campaign, if the players are eating and drinking the food without even thinking to check if it's poisoned, I feel like they deserve to be poisoned.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
So maybe it would be a little cruel if your game group doesn't do that very often, and then all of a sudden they're like eating and drinking and they're all poisoned. But it's like
Yeah.
that's something that could definitely be thrown in if you handle it with care. Like again, it would suck if everybody died. Just
Yeah.
it's like a TBK because
Yeah.
their dish is poisoned. But you could easily work it into where maybe it's a knockout poison, they get
Mhm.
captured, or or give them a chance to notice that it's poisoned. But that for me is the obvious one right off the bat.
I've done the like you sit down for a meal with the big bad on accident before know they're the big bad and right the whole thing is poison. Like that's a fun moment where it's like like we should have checked beforehand.
Yeah.
The Princess Bride comes to mind. That scene with the poison like the poison cups. It's just like
Yeah.
it's so good, right? Like it is an excellent way to handle that. I mean, I don't know if you could really exactly do that in a game, right? Because there's just some smart stuff that only works in a movie, right? Going
Yeah.
on.
That's almost like a combat scene.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's something really cool about that. Right,
Yeah.
yeah, like investigative abilities are coming into play and all that sort of stuff in preparation.
Another thing is, and well, I know this is a family friendly podcast, so I won't go too deeply into it, but alcohol is also a component that we have in Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades, and that's a big part of wuxia and Chinese culture. So that's another obvious one. We actually have mechanical elements of the game worked around that. So I know could be a sensitive topic for some people. So that would be appropriate for the appropriate game group. We have it as a full-on mechanical element of the character sheet, and it can be worked into the plot directly. So whether or not you port it, you would consider porting that into another game. That's obviously dependent on the group, but you totally could. Like I could definitely see a tavern scene in D&D where
Mhm.
you could use almost the same mechanics we have for the drinking stuff in Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades. Easily could work out to you have a barbarian getting involved essentially in a drinking contest with
Yeah,
somebody else or something along those lines. So that's another obvious one that I feel like is a easy way to port from wuxia into other genres.
That does
yeah.
sound really fun.
I was just gonna ask, like, so think about that barbarian, right? And going back to your D10 table of different poisons and stuff, right? Yeah, can you explain a little bit more? Like, how would you come up with like interesting sorts of poisons if you want to go down that road, right? Like, so there's obviously like the one that kills you is probably not going to be appropriate for the game. Knockout poisons, stuff that probably like makes you lose all your dexterity, that sort of stuff. Are there any other kind of interesting ones that either of you have run across?
Yeah, well, in terms of how to come up with him or how we came up with him, one of the things throughout this entire book for Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades is we wanted everything in the book to feel like it's something that you could read about in a book or see in a movie, but at the same time not have it be obvious copies of movies or
Hmm.
books. Like everything in here is our original stuff. A lot of stuff takes shades of interpretation from movies and stuff, but nothing is like just, oh well, this is the character from this
Yeah.
movie, but we gave him a different name. We don't do
Hmm.
anything like that. So how we came up with those poisons was just straight up imagination. And
Hmm.
one thing you'll find out is if you read a lot of wuxia or watch a lot of it, is it's a lot of very over the top and very just off the wall imagination levels. So
Hmm.
that's what we tried to do. I think one of the ones that we have that I liked a lot is a poison that, so in Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades, everything is about your martial arts. You have 3 key types of martial arts and you have ranks in those martial arts. So we have a poison that basically reduces all of your ranks in all of your martial arts to 0. So it basically turns you into an ordinary person with no abilities until you get the antidote to that poison. So
Oh, that's great.
that's another trope that happens in the novels that I translate, not necessarily the wuxia novels, but in the more high fantasy stuff. It's a real common trope for the main character to at some point in the story. Well, same thing in comic books and stuff as well. The
Hmm.
main character loses their powers.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
common story, and that can be fun. I do have to say though, I've never actually used that poison on a character. I've never actually run that kind of scenario in
Yeah.
a game, so this is all theoretical, but I can
Yeah.
imagine how it would be a cool
Yeah.
twist.
You've been polymorphed into a middle-aged man. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah, well, that makes me
Yeah.
think. When I think poisons, my mind starts thinking of like real life poisons, right?
Hmm.
This one will make you nauseous, and this one will have this other debilitating physical effect. But what you were saying, Jeremy, makes me wonder if, at least in a D&D context, you could take like the effect of a spell and just have the vector of that spell almost be the poison, and then
Hmm.
that unlocks a whole wacky range of things. It suddenly sounds a lot more fun than just some variant of like, okay, you have a -3 penalty on dexterity for
Yeah.
the next hour.
Yeah, so Jeremy, I don't know how many video games and stuff you play, but so Andy and I were actually just talking about Final Fantasy 15 a little bit earlier today. There's this really great scene in it. It's cup noodles like sponsored part of development or something. So there's a commercial for cup noodles like inside the game. But anyway, so that game in particular is pretty fascinated with food. There's a whole sort of like cooking mini game in there. Like it's not poison, right? But it actually gives you buffs, and like increases your abilities and stuff. So you have to go and find these recipes and find the ingredients and sit down and actually find time to cook them and then use them like that. I'm kind of wondering if there's opportunities and stuff that you could use in game to give yourself buffs rather than
I can totally see that. Speaking of food stuff, there's one of my favorite scenes in a wuxia novel is from one of the classic Condor Heroes novels, which are now, there are fan translations and official translations of them, but basically in one of the famous scenes, or sections in one of these stories, the lead female character is trying to get a technique from one of the old master characters, and the old master character is a big foodie, and she
Mm.
knows how to cook, and so he demands that she cook him. I can't remember how many. It's like 72,
Yeah.
dishes or something. I forget what it was, and so she has to go on this big quest to find recipes to cook for him. She
Oh, that's
steals I think if I remember correctly, she like steals a duck recipe from the imperial mansion, or it's been a long time
yeah.
since I read it, but
Yeah.
it seems like it would be a fun kind of thing to throw into a campaign, a food related quest where you're having to find recipes that will help
Mhm.
somebody or something like that.
Oh, totally. Yeah, because I mean, think about it. Like, okay, so you've just finished your big adventure, like that. Like, you're having a party. You're gonna have a feast and stuff. Like, what if the meals at that feast were from recipes that you collected along the way, right? Like, that could be like super fun. I think for the right sort of player to have that little side quest running the whole game.
Chris, that was actually what I was going to bring up, was that use of food in that video gamey way, where if you like eat the pizza, you have like plus 10 hit points,
Yeah.
for the next 24 hours or something. And that feels a little too blatantly video gamey for me, just plug into D&D. But I do like the idea of like the food you eat will affect your experience throughout the day. So as each day starts, select from these options. I'm not sure if that would be too finicky or not, but it would cause the players to pay attention to something that otherwise you just kind of hand wave a
Mhm.
lot.
Yeah, I wonder if it's somewhat like encumbrance rules, where if you reduce it just to constantly checking in your spreadsheet to make sure that you're under a certain number, it's like that's not as fun. But if there's some sort of like in-game story reason for it, like it's more fun. Same thing, like if food is reduced to rations, right, in your game, like you got to make sure that you have 5 ration units with you at all times. Like that's less interesting versus like, oh, we need to hunt and find something to eat, like, yeah, and have the appropriate recipes and stuff like that. It's almost like with a lot of things in GMing, it's almost the care that the GM puts into it is what makes it alive and worth playing. The care that the GM puts into presenting, I guess, to the players and the players interacting with it, right? That kind of interplay.
One of the settings we have in Righteous Blood Ruthless Blades, one of the maps that we have is actually a wine house, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
And one thing I did with that when I used it in my playtesting, or actually, no, it wasn't playtesting, it was just a for fun campaign that I did, was I had the adventure set in that wine house, and I created a menu for the White
Mm,
House with like special noodle dishes and stuff, with different how much they cost. And my players really dug it. Like they were
yeah.
wanting to know like what are the ingredients in this one? Like why is this one so expensive? And at that
Huh.
time, I didn't even have any positive effects. Like it wasn't they didn't get a buff or anything. But when they heard
Mhm.
like, oh, they have the 18 dragon noodles with special chili peppers from
Yeah.
Sichuan, they were like, whoa, I want to have that. And it's like they're spending double for the amount of normal noodles that had literally no effect on
Yes.
anything, but they were totally digging it. So hey.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's great.
They'll remember it forever and you'll remember it. Yeah.
And
That's super fun.
one aspect of food that maybe it's almost too obvious is just the cultural place that food has, like in the
Mhm.
types of stories you're telling. And I mean, if you think about when I think about just in my boring American life, the centrality of food and the effect that food has on like my relationships, we use food to comfort people, to thank them. I don't do that. You could use food or the way you serve it to insult somebody.
Yes.
Like there's food is like really tied into our interactions with almost everyone in our lives.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's more of a meta thing as you think about the course of the story you want, the setting in the story you want to GM. But when I think about that, it's amazing that there's not a chapter about like food in like the player in the Dungeon Master's Guide or something, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
There
there is.
probably is,
I
but
haven't.
no one's read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read the DMG, so don't email and tell me there is a chapter about food.
Yeah.
I realized what I was alluding at earlier. I didn't express it very clearly, but what you said kind of made me some pieces click. If you were, for example, running a mystery adventure, food could be an awesome part of it. We have a section in
Huh.
the Reich's Blood book that's called. It's just a sidebar. So there's a famous Wuxia detective character named Detective D, I think based off of a real life character. And so our little sidebar is your player Detective D or are they playing Detective D? And the point of this is basically, are you expecting the player to pick up on all of these clues,
Hmm.
or is it that the character that they're playing is like super smart and will notice these things, but the player might not necessarily notice them? That's kind of an important thing, especially when you're dealing with a game like Ruthless Blades that has a lot of cultural context, which you mentioned.
Hmm.
The reason I bring it up is food could be an awesome clue. Like, let's say you're searching for a person and you know that this person is from South China and your characters, however, are in North China. Then they notice, for example, a shop that's selling food items that are unique to South China. Well, that could
Hmm.
be a big clue now. But then again, the players might not notice that. So you would have to weigh it in terms of like
Yeah.
what I was talking about. Is the character going to know it, or is the player going to know it? That's a
Mhm.
GM decision that obviously is going to be affected by the player's knowledge. But you could do the same thing. I feel like in Dungeons and Dragons setting, assuming you handled it with finesse and care. Are you
Yeah.
in a human run city and you're looking for an orc? Well, maybe you could go looking where orc food is sold, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
um,
Hmm. Yeah.
Regardless of whatever genre it is, I think you can totally tie food and drink into it, especially in that kind of context.
That's a really clever way, I think, of putting that sort of like, yeah, should the players discover it, yeah, or should you just sort of tell them,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, like so if the only clue you have in that entire city is like, did you happen to catch that I mentioned that this place sells Southern Chinese cuisine? Like, yeah, maybe rethink that as your only clue. But
Yeah, I would probably only use that. Thinking about it, I would probably only use it in a group that's really plugged into
yeah,
Chinese cuisine and food. Either that or make it the subject of a role or something.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
But I mean, talk about like something that if the players picked up on it, they would feel so clever, right? Like that's the sort of thing. I mean, oh yeah, that would be like, oh, yeah, making all those connections. I think it's a really fun part about gaming. Andy, you were mentioning something about like insulting people with food, and I just had this vision of like being in a tavern or whatever, and like all the other tables keep getting their food before you,
Yeah.
right? And like just trying to push that and see like how long before before the barbarian starts, flagging the waiter down, asking like, what's happening.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're probably coming up on time here, but does anyone have any sort of final thoughts on the topic of food and drink in an RPG that we didn't touch on or they want to share? or a favorite moment involving those things in a game they've run or played in, or anything like that?
I've got nothing. Look like you're thinking, Jeremy, though. So we'll give you a second.
Well, I guess my final thought is just, and I hate to always be being, sorry, I hate to always be bringing it back to Righteous Blood, but I guess that's kind of
Yeah.
what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great.
There just is such an element of formality in treating people to food and drink in Chinese culture, and so we include that in the game, and I think it's a cool thing to do. Who's toasting who and returning toasts. Like, this goes back to the drinking part, just because there's a whole section on drinking culture in the
Mhm.
book, because it is pretty important in
Yeah.
terms of who is toasting who, the order of who's being toasting, who is doing the toasting, returning the favor, that kind of thing. There's just
Yeah.
endless amounts of opportunities in the built-in adventure that we have in the book. One of the very first encounters is supposed to be at a roadside tavern, encountering some local thugs who are kind of getting drunk, and you can very easily incorporate a situation where they're trying to goad the players into a drinking contest, and do the
Hmm.
players uh, go along with it? Do the players
Yeah.
outdrink them? Do the players refuse to participate? It just can go so many ways, and whichever way it goes, there's an opportunity to have it be a really fun scene.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
That does sound awesome.
Cool.
All right, well, guys, I think it's about time for us to wrap up.
Mhm.
Jeremy, we're really grateful that you took a chunk of your day and you shared it with us. We'll highlight a number of different things like your website, and we'll point to some of your work in the show notes. So if you're listening, go check that out on the website. And Chris, do we have any other wrap up stuff we need to do here?
I don't think so. I mean, I will go into my whole spiel if we're all set. But yeah, thanks again, Jeremy.
It was my pleasure, and thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
All right, Chris, take us away.
Cool. All right. Roll for Topic is part of the Roll for It Media Podcasting Network. Our sister show, The Splatbook, can be found as thesplatbook.com. John Corey and Kyle Latino host that one, and it is always a delight. So go check them out. Yeah. Again, Jeremy, really appreciate you being here. And taking the time. It was super great. But I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rao.
Remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.